You are listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. This is Jack Stockwell. And I have quite the program. It looks like everything is going to work here. I am recording. I'm broadcasting at K-Talk at the same time. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Paul, for getting this deficiency undeficienced. So anyway, it is the 11th day of March, 2025. And you're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell. Boy, I've got a real program for you today that I've been trying to put together, not the least of which I'm going to start with some stuff with Russia, finally driving the infidels out of Kursk. And then some very interesting information compiled by Professor Joseph Chung at the I think the University of Montreal, if I remember right, on America's perpetual wars. This is very, very interesting information. Thank you, Nick. And thanks for resetting X, because I've been getting some comments about X. So I think we're up and running. And then I want to talk about the bloodbath that is going on in Syria, bloodbath essentially created by American policies. Some of them, most of it began with Obama, of course, then carried on by Trump, and then definitely accelerated by Biden. And now what's Trump going to do about it? Because this is a long-standing problem. And then also the COVID-era smearing and resurrection of the Trump NIH appointee, Dr. Che Bacharya. I think that's how you pronounce it. One of my heroes, in fact, from the University of Southern California. And what they're trying to do to stop that. And if there is time at the end of before the program's over, some information on tariffs being theft by Ron Paul, and what we can, or what kind of sense we can make out of that. So welcome, everybody, this Tuesday morning. So I am just going to turn that volume down now that I can see that I am broadcasting. So the news broke Friday, Saturday, whatever, that the Russian forces had really sharply escalated their offensive, aimed at driving the Ukrainian troops out of what remains of their foothold inside Russia, in and around the town of Sludza, in the Kursk region. And the armed forces of the Ukraine had invaded Kursk, as you remember, last August. And after 3 days of fighting, the Russian forces are advancing east, west, north, south towards the town, retaking control of village after village, taking many POWs, taking more POWs than they're killing, while threatening to surround the remaining Ukrainian forces based in Sludza itself. And estimates of how many of the armed forces of Ukraine troops that are in the area range from 6,000 by Russian estimates, 10,000 by the Ukrainian estimates, and simultaneously Russian forces stepped up their incursions into Ukraine's adjoining Sumy region. So the Russian move is not complete as of this writing, of course, but it has already delivered a very timely blow to Zelensky's bluster of using the territory Ukraine held inside Russia as a bargaining chip in any negotiations, which is a further piece of evidence of how this man is deeply insane, deeply troubled, that somehow they were going to grab a part of Russian territory with their elite forces that they brought up to Kursk, slowly being destroyed day by day, hour by hour, day by day, to the point where there's hardly anything left to defend, and now they're finally laying down their weapons because they know they're going to be treated better by the Russian forces than they are by their own commanders, who I don't know that they have the Hannibal doctrine in the Ukrainian forces as the IDF has. But in any event, they know they're going to be better treated, their wounds are going to be taken care of, they're going to be fed, and then they can decide what they want to do after that. So anyway, this idea that somehow Zelensky was going to hold on to this piece of property so that when they sit down to bargain a peace deal, a ceasefire deal, excuse me, that they can say, well, we'll give you the Kursk back, you give us back Donetsk. Just, you know, I mean, that makes as much sense. I'm off the tower, huh? Well, I don't know what to do, except maybe this. Perhaps this will make a difference at the tower. Let's see if this does make a difference. We'll just have to wait and see. There's always the possibility of a double broadcast, so let me know one way or the other, Paul. Appreciate it. I mean, this is like, you know, at Appomattox and General Lee surrendering to the American forces, and Grant in particular, and Lee, you know, offering his sword in, you know, surrender, says, we'll stop the war if you give us all the southern states back again. I mean, that's how much sense Zelensky makes to me. So anyway, a withdrawal ahead of these peace talks would be a severe blow to Ukraine's bargaining position anyway, and Zelensky has said that Ukraine's occupation of the Kursk is likely to play a crucial role in future potential future negotiations. So the Kyiv Independent wrote in just a big alarm about this, that they're looking for peace talks and a ceasefire. And of course, the Russians have already said there's not going to be a ceasefire. You're going to surrender or we're going to go to Kyiv. That's it. They also want Kharkov and they want Odessa because it's Russian. I mean, it's Ukrainian territory, but they're all Russians who live there. In fact, the referendum that was passed back in 2014 when Russia took over the Crimea was because 9 out of 10 Crimeans are Russians. Anyway, the Syrsky, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, is denying right now, as of yesterday's news releases, that the Russian or the Ukrainian forces are in trouble at Kursk. But he says the units are taking timely measures to maneuver to favorable defensive lines. Well, that's a bunch of gobbledygook. The center of the Russian offensive was daring an operation carried out by anywhere from 100 to 800 Russian special forces. I did, Paul. I did restart it. And that the wide diameter Soviet era. I think I know what you mean. Excuse me, everybody. Paul, I need to know if the transmitter is playing now. That's the thing I need to know. Because I'm not getting any adverse. I'm not getting any adverse information from people who normally let me know if they can't pick me up on the tower. So anyway, this wide diameter Soviet era pipeline from Urengoy in Siberia to Uruzgorod on the western border of the Ukraine, opposite Slovakia, crosses from Russia into the Ukraine at Sudzha, which is where the Ukrainian forces are headquartered now in the Kursk region. And it's been turned off. I'm not very loud on simple radio or X. Want to try Facebook? YouTube? Apparently YouTube does the best of all. And I would be on YouTube at Global Affairs Unfiltered at YouTube, broadcasting live. That might be better than X. All right, so as I was saying there, what the whole idea of the shutting down of this gas line and the Russian troops who infiltrated through the pipeline, interestingly enough, emerged on the southern outskirts of Sudzha, making it possible to cut off all of the Ukrainian forces north of the town and from those within it. Now, who would ever think to do that? This is a very big, wide gas line that went from Siberia all the way across the Ukraine to almost to the border of Slovakia. And the Russians turned the gas off there a long time ago. Wouldn't you think, if you were part of the Ukrainian forces, I wonder if they could move an army through that pipeline? Well, that's what they did. Yeah. And now they're taking back the rest of the Sudzha area of Kursk. On Sunday, President Trump strongly reasserted, and I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, to host Maria Bartiromo on the Fox News talk show Sunday Morning Futures, that monster nuclear weapons could end the world, saying that that could happen tomorrow, he said. So Trump has come back to the nuclear threat to civilization 3 times during the last month, sometimes within the context of the NATO proxy war against Russia. And so in his March 9th Fox News interview, he said this: "We spend a lot of money on nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons. The level of destruction is beyond anything you can even imagine. It's just bad that everybody has to spend all this money on something that, if it's used, is probably the end of the world." Bartiromo's response was, "Wow, I don't know what to say to that." Well, for Pete's sake, where have you been, Maria? So Trump said, "When I listen to these climate lunatics, and they talk about global warming, and they say the ocean is going to rise 1/8 of an inch in the next 300 years, and nobody ever talks about nuclear weapons and some of the other things, but the nuclear weapons are particular right now. And they talk about the climate, and they talk about the dangers of climate, but they don't talk about the dangers of a nuclear weapon, which could happen tomorrow. They say in 300 years, and I watched Biden for years say the existential threat. He loved the term existential threat. He said our greatest existential threat is from the climate. And I said, no, the greatest existential threat is sitting in shelves in various countries called nuclear weapons that are big monsters that can blow your heads off for miles and miles and miles, and they never mention that. Elsewhere, of course, Trump has called for reduction in the number of nuclear weapons. Apparently, back on February 12th, with the first conversation between Trump and Putin, that was one of the major discussions, stepping down from their nuclear stockpiles. So when Trump met Zelensky last week in the Oval Office, he reportedly said, and this is the thing that stood out the most in my mind, "You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III," he said, which could easily escalate to nuclear war. So back on February 13th, speaking to a room full of reporters gathered at the White House, Trump signaled his interest in restarting arms control negotiations with Russia and China. He said, "There's no reason for us to be branding new nuclear weapons. We already have so many. You can destroy the world 50 times over, 100 times over. And here we are building new nuclear weapons. And we're all spending a lot of money that we could be spending on other things that are actually, hopefully, much more productive." So this is, this is part of of trying to figure out where this guy's coming from. I honestly believe Trump wants peace. I know there's tons of negotiation. He's a complete sellout to the IDF and the ADL and the AIPAC, and he's an Israeli puppet. And I've seen all the stuff that everybody else has seen. I still think he's got a backstabbing dagger in his hand, and it's Israel he's going to backstab. I still believe that. I think he's just setting the chess pieces up and may even sacrifice the queen in order to win the day. And speaking of that, if Israel hadn't already done enough damage to human beings, Israel just cut off the electricity to Gaza here last weekend. And the energy minister, Eli Cohen, said he instructed the Israeli Electric Corporation to immediately stop selling electricity to power stations in Gaza, as though Gaza has any money to pay for it. Turn it off, he said. Turn off that electricity. Let them eat cake. He said, "We will employ all the tools available to us so that hostages will return." So since March 2nd, Israel has blocked the entry of humanitarian aid and medicine and fuel and all the other goods into Gaza. You know, a policy reminiscent of course, what the Nazis did to the Warsaw Ghetto. Warsaw Ghetto, if I remember right, lasted about 6 weeks before they finally succumbed to the Nazi invasion. This is what's happened in the Gaza, of course, has been going on for more than a year now. But today, a war crime, nonetheless backed by the Western civilized world, especially the United States, is backing this up. The United States government, State Department, the Office of the President, whatever else, is as complicit in genocide as are those who actually turn off the electricity and shoot. And some of the stories that are coming out from some of the doctors, Without Borders, and some of the stories of it's too disturbing what the IDF is doing to children. So the electric cutoff will affect the Deir al-Balah desalination plant, the only such plant that provides clean water to the Palestinians. And it's in the central and northern areas of Gaza. The Water Authority official, Omar Shatada, there will be a big struggle in supplying water. Boy, you think? We need a solution. Potable water is the basis of life. The Deir al-Balah desalination plant was providing 18,000, a very paltry amount, mind you, 18,000 cubic meters of water per day to Gaza. That's been cut by 86% to about 2,500 cubic meters per day. Now, for those of you listening who live in Utah Valley, I don't know about the streams coming down the Cottonwoods or some of the other streams that feed Salt Lake County, but the Provo River. I remember talking to a games person there like 50 years ago or so when I was fly fishing for trout on the lower Provo. And I asked him how much water is coming through here. And the runoff, he said, is up to 25,000 cubic meters of water per day is coming down the Provo River at the spring runoff. 25,000 cubic meters. In fact, the more I think about it, I'm not so sure that that number is high enough. However, that's what the desalination plant was providing to northern central Gaza, 18,000 cubic meters of water per day. It's now, because of cutting off the power to the desalination plant, down to 2,500 cubic meters per day. Now, phase one of the ceasefire reached January 15th, expired March 1st. Hamas and the other forces in Palestine have stated that it is time, per the ceasefire plan, to move to phase two. And of course, the biggest obstacle to that right now is Netanyahu's refusing. And he called for just an extension of phase one, hoping to block phase two realization altogether. So on March 7th, the Wall Street Journal article, Israel draws up new war plans to pressure Hamas, has disclosed what Israel and apparently Trump have threatened if Hamas doesn't release the hostages. And the subtitle of the article is this: as ceasefire talks stall, Israel has charted a course for gradually increasing pressure on Hamas to the point of another invasion of the Gaza Strip. So the Journal reported on the Israeli plan for that much more slaughter. The Journal says this: Israel has drafted plans for a series of escalatory steps to gradually ratchet up pressure on Hamas. The steps kicked off in the past week with Israel blocking the entry of goods and supplies into Gaza. The next moves would include cutting off electricity and water, said Smotrich, Israel's powerful finance minister, who said the measures were discussed in a cabinet meeting last weekend. If those steps fail, Israel could turn to a campaign of airstrikes and tactical raids against Hamas targets. An Israeli security analyst briefed on the plan said, next, Israel could again displace the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have used the ceasefire to return to their homes in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Ultimately, Israel could reinvade Gaza with far more military power than it has deployed so far in the conflict. And where is that increase in military power coming from? Oh, maybe 1,800 2,000-pound bombs that Mr. Trump delivered. This quote in the Journal continues here: there's a determination to go back in and finish Hamas no matter what happens, said former Pentagon official Michael Makovsky, who is now president of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. The Jewish Institute for National Security of America. I've never heard of them. They're a think tank based in Washington. I think Israel will go in tougher and stronger. That would ensure that no lives will be spared. And we're a part of that. We are a part of that. Remember, when May 30th rolls around and we celebrate Memorial Day, we might want to keep in mind the Palestinians that were killed too. I don't know. This is extremely disturbing. So the strategic situation is undergoing dramatic shifts, as I said yesterday, tectonic earthquake-type shifts, day by day by day, and it's very clear that the situation is flying in all directions. If you look, for example, at the relation between Europe and the United States, which supposedly was part of the collective West, this transatlantic alliance, this friendship, this special relationship, whatever, is now turning very rapidly into a relationship of animosity, to say the least. I mean, even hostility and enmity. And I think this is extremely worrisome and absolutely needs to be changed. Now, some of the predicates for that. It's very clear that while Trump is trying to bring the Ukraine war to an end by establishing some direct communication, in particular with Russia, the Europeans are more and more hysterical about their intention to continue the war in the Ukraine, which can only bring the United States and Europe into a direct confrontation with one another if this isn't changed quickly. Trump said he's cutting off all war-making material to the Ukraine, although some is still leaking through. We know that because the satellite pictures show it's there. And Trump has cut off all satellite support for the Ukrainian army so that they can find out where the Russians are. Now, it's one thing, you know, from the Ukrainian point of view, things that go bump in the night, usually you can hear where that bump is, and usually it's down there in the basement. Nobody's going to go in the basement in the middle of the night. But when you don't know where the bump in the middle of the night is coming from, and it's getting closer, what kind of an effect is that going to have on you as these Ukrainian divisions no longer have U.S. satellite support to locate Russian positions? So I think it's very clear that Trump is trying to stop this thing over there. But if this isn't changed really quickly, the enmity that is building between European nations and the United States, I mean, there could be hell to play with that as well. And so von der Leyen, she was asking for 800 billion euros. Merz, the new, who will be Chancellor of Germany, I think in April, wants 600 billion euros. Baerbock, Germany's, you know, quintessential idiot of idiots, is saying that we have to rearm and rebuild the army of Germany to be prepared for the Russians. And now the head of German foreign intelligence, the BND, their CIA, Bruno Kohl, in an interview, basically admitted that the war was supposed to last at least until 2029. And if you look at what he says, you get a flavor of how these people are turning reality inside out and upside down. I mean, he says this: the world order as we knew it since the 1990s, which was on the side of Russia, pushing back on the protection of NATO and an expansion of the sphere of influence of Russia in the direction of the West, at best without the Americans in Europe. Now, this is on top of the NATO expansion, which broke the promises that clearly were made to Gorbachev, and eyewitnesses of that were Matlock and Genscher and some of the other German officials, that these promises were given, and the real reason for this war has been the NATO expansion to the east and the threat to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that way they create the reverse Cuban Missile Crisis. And all the major speakers and critics from the VIPs, the Veterans Peace, whatever, veteran, whatever, Jeffrey Sachs, Chase Freeman, regular guests on the Napolitano shows, have said very clearly that it was the other way around. So you have an effort by the head of the German foreign intelligence to reverse the narrative completely. The only problem is the German population is being bombarded with all these kinds of statements nonstop. And you turn on the morning radio, the late evening talk shows, it's an absolute propaganda warfare along these kinds of lines that Germany needs to rearm itself and get ready to fight Russia by 2029. And because the Ukrainian war is not going to last to 2029, the Germans and now the French, the Brits, all talk, Poles, Bruno said absolutely there's not going to be any Polish troops in the Ukraine. But Macron wants to send them. The English want to send them. Now, Ivan Timofeev, I've quoted in the past, who's the vice president of the Russia International Affairs Council and an analyst at the Valdai Club, wrote a larger piece for a publication where he says the EU has become the main threat to global peace, with European leaders hoping the U.S. Democrats will win the next election and undo the Trump changes. That's what they're hoping. They're hoping that in 4 years from now, if they can last that long, which will be 2029, there will be a Democratic president who gets back in the White House and will undo everything that Trump is trying to do in that region of the world to stop nuclear war. Now, if Russia starts to say Europe is the main danger to world peace, which they are saying, that's not a good sign for things to come. Because the explanation is basically, according to an article that I just read in RT, which is pretty much what one can see, is namely that the Europeans are now preparing for a direct confrontation with the biggest state of Eurasia, Russia. And the reason for this is the primary concern of holding on to power. And I think that really is the reason. It's not any hope it can't possibly be successful. And the article goes on to say, while the EU states may not be preparing for a direct military confrontation with Russia, their entanglement in the Ukraine and its reliance on a failing strategy could escalate tensions unpredictably. Many Western European politicians have staked their careers on the survival of the Kyiv regime, making them willing to take extreme measures to justify their past decisions. This collective political egoism is now manifesting as an inability to acknowledge mistakes or alter course. Now, if little old me and the kind of information that I can draw from various sources around the world can see that this war is all but over, it's just cleaning up the pieces, getting a few more surrenders before you turn all these POWs back to the Ukraine, with the promise not to pick up a gun again. If I can see that, why can't these European leaders see this? I mean, they are absolutely sold on the concept. You keep this going on long enough, the Russian Empire will collapse. When exactly the opposite is happening. The GDP for last year in Russia is greater than about 10 European countries put together. All the sanctions that the West, including the United States, placed on Russia has caused Russia to turn its market to a different direction, and now they're thriving. Even the best arms people say that Russia will make in 1 month enough armament to continue this war that the combined effort of Europe would need a year to do. I think it's very clear that the Europeans should have recognized that their subservience to the London, New York, Pentagon world and its effort to build a unipolar world is all the things that entailed regime change, color revolution, interventionist wars, sanctions, the whole thing. It backfired because it caused an unprecedented blowback from the countries of the global south, which went to the alternative of allying with BRICS. and all these countries refusing to condemn the so-called Russian aggression in the Ukraine, refusing to take the NATO narrative. I mean, the whole which was the whole effort to isolate Russia has completely failed. And rather than recognizing that there may have been a mistake in their plans, these same Europeans who completely abandoned any claim to sovereignty, now that Trump is forcing them, saying the game is over, now they're left with their imperial outlook. And I think this is a danger and a tragedy which absolutely has got to change, because the problem is obviously that you have people like von der Leyen and Kallas who have very little competence. And if you look at the domestic careers of these two women, they have been catastrophic. I mean, what von der Leyen as defense minister did to the Bundeswehr in destroying the backbone of the German army is being lamented as the big problem. And similarly, Kallas, who was Estonia's prime minister, is definite that the orientation is completely wrong, because you look at the current outcome. And just to give another example, it's now feared that the United States may remotely disable F-35 fighter jets, which Berlin has ordered in the event of a crisis, basically doing the same thing that was done to the Ukrainian military by freezing access to intelligence. I didn't know you could do that. As soon as I heard about it, it only made sense. Yeah, of course. You flip a button somewhere in Omaha, and the F-35s won't fire. They won't start up because of, you know, it's just like my Tesla, my electric car. Tesla has regular software updates. And I don't know what they're going to do till I see what they've done. And that car is so stinking complicated now. There's a good thing to it. They're all advantageous changes. It's just so cotton picking complicated that there on the little computer screen is the owner's manual, which is, my goodness, it's got to be several hundred pages thick now. My mouth is covered by Global Affairs Unlimited. Your mouth is covered. I don't understand that. I don't understand what that means. Or maybe my hand is drifting over my mouth. But anyway, the United States can flip a button and disable the F-35 jets, which they're threatening to do if Germany, Berlin has ordered several of these with the idea of being prepared for a crisis. And the German Air Force is supposed to receive 35 American-made F-35A Lightning II jets starting in 2026, which is part of the recent $8.3 billion deal. And the expert Wolfgang Ischinger, the former president of the Munich Security Conference, questioned the fate of that contract by saying, if we fear that the U.S. could do with future German F-35s what they're doing with the Ukraine now, we might consider terminating this contract. I mean, can you... Oh, I see. All right, well, let me see what I can do about that. I would have to talk to my... webmaster. I don't know, Nick, if you're listening or not, but people are saying the Global Affairs title on there is covering up my mouth. Okay, now I understand. Or I could pull back a bit, Bruce, so you know that this brilliant stream of information you're hearing is actually coming from me. So, I mean, it has to sink. No matter how you look at this has got to sink in to some degree to the Munich Security Conference people about what he just said. And ever since he took it over, by the way, it has become the absolute mouthpiece for the military-industrial complex on both sides of the Atlantic. And if he is now voicing this European anti-American thrust, I think it really illustrates to a greater dimension what's actually happening in Europe right now, let alone Germany. So obviously Europe is also called a dictatorship. by more and more people, the last of them being a Romanian presidential frontrunner, Georgescu, who was just banned by the Bucharest Central Electoral Bureau from the election on the grounds that there was supposedly 1,000 challenges against him, calling him anti-democratic, extremist, when he was actually leading in the polls in the May presidential election with about 45% in the polls, so they shut him down. He now, of course, is saying that the European Union is a dictatorship because they had the ability to do that. Well, the Europeans don't have a concept, because if it would come to a confrontation, the Europeans at this point are still buying the vast majority, 80% of their military equipment from outside the EU. 63% of it is coming from the United States. So if they have an adversarial relationship to the United States, I mean, it's completely ridiculous. And according to the condition of the British Army, I think they have 4 fighting planes that function. I'm serious. This is the latest intelligence. The Royal Air Force has 4 airplanes that will fly. The size of their army has shrunk enormously low in sight of the invading Russian army in the Ukraine. They have no concept of how to repair their nuclear umbrella because it's being withdrawn, because they cannot use their nuclear weapons without American intelligence support. The French can, but the Brits can't. The United Kingdom is slowly fading away to a small island that essentially it was before Elizabeth pulled off the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And I think it's only extra human efforts that created that fire that burned the Armada. So the next time you are attacking a country and you're doing it with sailing vessels, make sure the closer you get to the target, the further apart these ships are, so that if a cyclone or a hurricane were to show up that would blow all these ships together in one small tiny area, make sure your sails are covered with fire retardant. And then you might not suffer the same fate the Armada did. But I think that's where the British military forces are shrinking back to now. And so if you look at Macron's proposal to expand the French nuclear shield for all of Europe, which he just did this weekend, oh, don't worry, our British brothers, you can't use your missiles. We'll spread the dome we have over France to all of Europe. Oh, just utterly ridiculous. So the British nuclear forces, you can forget it. Totally dependent on the United States. And therefore, the declaration by the French sovereignists and former military officers that I was mentioning early yesterday, opposing sharing the French nuclear deterrent, is extremely important. And that needs to be considered when all these French military experts, most of them retired, said absolutely not, you do not share this, because it makes all of Europe a target, and then it lessens French response. So I honestly believe this rift that is growing now between the United States and Europe, because it can only lead to a terrible entanglement and war. As many prominent people as possible need to be brought into this. Those that are not being paid by the military-industrial complex, those that are not being paid by the World Economic Forum, those that are not being paid by the International Bank of Settlements, those that are not being paid by the International Monetary Fund, those who stand independent of all of this. These people have to come together pretty quick in Europe in the building of a new security and architecture, development architecture. Now, that's eminently possible. because you have Xi Jinping's 3 initiatives for the shared future of humanity, the Global Security Development and the Civilizational Initiative, which is meant very clearly as a blueprint. You've got President Putin in his discussion with his government last week that because of the military advances on the battlefield, that there's now a chance for a European security system, even a global security system. And you have to understand how that's working. On the one side, the Russians are saying, you guys are beat, you're defeated. Why don't you just go home and stop the bloodshed? And by the way, we have a way to ensure through a security design and architecture to make us all safe, Russia and Europe. Well, and then on the other side, you got these people saying, well, like Obama said, 12 years ago, Russia is just a gas station with nuclear weapons. that the Europeans believe that. And so the Europeans are thinking, no, you can't trust Putin. Obviously now you can't trust Trump. They're all against us. They all hate us. And I think it's very clear that Russia and China are thinking in that direction if the rapprochement between Trump and Putin continues, and the fact that its clear strategic partnership with Russia and China can absolutely not be severed, then it's likely possible to put on the agenda that you need an approach like the Peace of Westphalia, that the Schiller Institute is always talking about, that LaRouche was talking about before that brought on 150 years of peace between the warring nations of Europe, where parties sit down and work out the principle because they recognize that a continuation of war will leave no side victorious because they will all be dead. And with the kind of technology we have today, that would extend beyond the borders of Europe and Russia so that all the world would be dead. So maybe in a rapprochement where you sit down and reapproach these concepts between Russia and the United States, the signs that this is growing in potential is evident every day. Peskov greeted the United States, Rubio, and his formulation that the Ukraine war is actually a proxy war. This is knocked my socks off when Rubio said this. I mean, what you got out of Blinken was that the Russians are all bad and the Ukrainians are all good. And now Rubio, just a couple of weeks ago, says, no, this isn't really Ukraine against Russia. This is NATO against Russia. And that makes complete sense that these countries leading the proxy war, sitting together, need to come together and make some kind of an arrangement. And in preparation for the G7 foreign ministers meeting, Trump's insisting that the formulation in respect to Russia be softened. Obviously, the United States is totally giving up the attempt by the previous transatlantic community to isolate Russia. It used to be the G8, you know, now it's the G7 because the 7 won't let G8 Russia in. Trump is saying, you ought to sit back a minute and reconsider that. You know, I'm not often left without words. But when I think of, it kind of comes back to the Epstein papers. You know, we're going to review, we're going to review, they're not going to be revealed. And if they get revealed, they're going to be so redacted, it probably won't even say Epstein papers at the top of the paper. It'll just be one big black sheet covered with ink because of the compromised position that a large portion of Congress, a large portion of our government, a large portion of our unelected bureaucracies all have made multiple trips to the island. Trump has made several trips himself. And so the point I'm trying to make is that if there are all these Americans have done it, we know there's all these Europeans that have done the same thing. And this goes back to not Palmerston, Queen Elizabeth's essentially Secretary of State. You know who I mean. They found, you know, the way they were able to control the dukes and the earls who were against Elizabeth. They didn't have photographs, but they would set these people up in the most controversial of human-to-human geography, trying to be delicate here, and have witnesses through peepholes who would testify against their behavior that would end up having their heads lopped off. Oh. Jack, come on, you know better than this. You know better than this. You know better than this. Sorry, I have to stop a transmission that's taking place. Glad I caught that out of the corner of my eye anyway. Of all the things I set up correctly, the major, most important one I didn't. Anyway, back to what I'm saying here is that these European leaders must be just as compromised as people are in our government. I mean, you look at Tom Cotton, for crying out loud. When I first heard of Cotton and some of the stuff that was coming out of his mouth, I thought, oh, here's a hero for the masses. You know how many heroes are left in Congress? Rand Paul, Thomas Massey. Let me think. This is all part of the British Empire. The controlling influence has always been the British Empire. Now, in decades past, hundreds and hundreds of years, that they learned from other sources. Now, some people say, well, it goes back to the protocols of the, what do you call it, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I remember reading that 50 years ago. Pretty thick. And that it was the learned Elders of Zion spread around Europe that were controlling the world through the banking system, Rothschilds, when in fact it was the British Empire that put the Rothschilds into their position. And the people who really control the world today, you don't know their names. You never see their images. They're never on TV. They're never in the news. People like Netanyahu, people that representing the World Economic Forum, some of the gangly, grisly old men that you see from time to time are but the clerks. They're just the clerks of the ruling families. Have you ever heard of the Thun and Thaxis family of Germany? That was pointed out to me about 20 years ago. The Thun and Thaxis family. They're the ones who got, before the year 1000 AD, the right to deliver the papal mail to all of the kings and queens and lords and mistresses and whatever of Europe, including England, even before, oh boy, my memory. The Great, the Norman, the Great. I'll think of it in a minute. And of course, when they're delivering the mail from the Pope to all the church centers and leaders of the Catholic Church, the Western Catholic Church throughout Europe, they knew what was going on and they knew what to do to take advantage of this and became one of the absolute wealthiest families in Europe. And they're still there. They're still there in Bavaria. But you never hear of them because they make sure they're never heard of. Now, this is the level of power that puts other people into compromised positions. It just didn't happen that Epstein just had a party one weekend, and it didn't just happen that human trafficking of minor children showed up, and it didn't just happen that various governmental leaders from around the world just happened to show up. It was all set up from the beginning to get these people into compromised positions so that they can be controlled. So when you hear Pam Bondi already backing down from some of the Epstein stuff, I know I was talking about Europe and Russia and America, but I'm varying from that because I want to get into this long enough, is that this is an old British Empire trick. And there are those who say, well, they learned it from the learned protocols, or the something protocols of the learned elders of Zion, or whatever that publication was, that has heavy, heavy criticism against it as being a false document, which is one reason why, maybe it isn't. When something comes out as heavy as it does against something from all corners of the globe, you might want to take a look at it, just like LaRouche. When I first had LaRouche on my radio program 30 years ago, or close to 30 years ago, Jack, what are you doing? This man's an international socialist. He's an American. He's an international socialist, Jack. What's the matter with you? Are you a communist too? So that made me really start to investigate this fellow. And everybody hated him. The far left says he's a fascist. The far right says he's a communist. So I started reading what he had to write. He's an American, believes in the American system. And so when I looked at the heavy load that came down against this guy from every direction, I figured he had something to say. Well, the same thing's going on with Trump, the same thing going on with Putin. I don't put them necessarily in the same category with LaRouche, or LaRouche in their category. But my whole point is, when the weight of government as a whole comes down on something, that something might have something to say. So when you look at Bondi, during her hearings, and, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and Trump, even in his first administration, we're going to get to the bottom of these things. And Trump could have released Assange in his first administration, and he didn't. And when he didn't release Assange, that raised a big red flag in the back of my mind. And the other whistleblowers, along with that, could have been released. They weren't. And now they're backing down from the Epstein list, because there's too many powerful names on that list, probably, and too many absolutely disgustingly horrible settings to keep these people under control. So when I see the weight of the media and the weight of political power and what Europe is doing now in trying to keep the war in Ukraine going without the advantage of the American involvement, and all these leaders, except for Orban, Fico, a couple of others are starting to come out saying, no, hell no, we won't go. We're not going to be a part of this. Then I have to look at it from that point of view. And in the U.S., the Senate, you have Rand Paul, who everybody hates, but you look at what he's saying. Now, Mike Lee, I don't know where Mike Lee stands on Israel. I haven't looked at it close enough, but I got a good idea. And wait a second, that's not fair for me to say that. I just said I'm not sure where he stands on Israel, and then I just said I have a good idea. That's contradictory. I take that back. I don't know where he stands. I haven't looked at that close enough, but I'll find out. So you have all these ramifications of all these regional conflicts that are going on, trying to keep this so-called war against Russia going. And so when I see absolute madness in the minds of the leaders of European governments, and then von der Leyen is in charge of the EU, for crying out loud, the things this woman is saying. And now Merz, who just got elected with the CDU party in Germany, who for 10 years was BlackRock's representative, well, you know where he's coming from, and you know where he's going to be going. Is he on the Epstein list? Is von der Leyen on the Epstein list? I suspect people were invited there in a rather candid, non-aggressive, just come and have a weekend with us. And now what they can do with AI and videos, you don't even have to go to Epstein Island anymore to be seen doing things that they would do on the Epstein Island. So when you look at Slovakia's Prime Minister Fico, what he said in light of all the proposals for the peace coming from China, Brazil, the Vatican, some African states for a Ukraine peace solution, none of them will work. The only working proposal, according to Fico, is that of Putin, because he's the only one who has a realistic plan. And Trump, on his side, on Putin's side, said that the Ukraine has demonstrated they don't want peace with Russia. And he said this ahead of the new meetings between the U.S. and Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia coming up. Now, the Chinese side was very self-evident in all of this. They put out a major statement by Wang Wen of the Changyang Institute for Financial Studies, the Financial Institute, who says the second term of Trump may not be all bad for all nations, especially China, that Trump's policies are unwittingly strengthening the country, and that Trump has now earned the nickname Chuan Jianguo, I hope I pronounced that right, which means make China great again. He says there's three notable contributions to China's rise made by Trump's first term. First, he shattered the image of the United States as a paragon of democracy, showing the deep social divisions inside the United States, and that the Chinese idealized the view of the United States as a beautiful country, which is actually the literal translation of China's name for the United States. China's name for the United States means beautiful country. Secondly, it pushed China's push for technological independence, especially when the 2018 arrest of the Huawei chief financial officer, Wang Zhou, in the crackdown in the Chinese tech firms, gave China the final kick to go for innovation and independence, and that's why they've made major breakthroughs in these record-high chip exports, surpassing even the United States. And then third, the trade war with China has driven rapid restructuring of global trade and forced China to shift away from the trade with the U.S., which fell from 17% to 11%, to the global south, which is now over 40%. Same thing that we did with Russia when we put the sanctions on Russia. Russia said, well, you think you're the only market? And they found out all these other markets, especially India and China, that gives them, they had something like a 3 to 4% increase in their GDP, I mean, over the last year. A 4% increase in GDP is very, very good, incidentally. So I've been all over the place. We're coming to the end of the first hour, but I'm not going to take a break here because of the stream. But one thing I wanted to say to those who are on the stream, I can't go on doing a 2-hour stream on X or Facebook. I keep saying Facebook, I mean YouTube. Well, I'll eventually be on Facebook, but not yet. I have to have a few more numbers. YouTube has around 800 subscribers, I think. X is still growing. It wouldn't hurt for you to, refer and subscribe and like and all that kind of stuff that you hear all the other people do, because it builds the audience bigger, and as soon as the audience is big enough, I can get on Facebook. But the point of all of this is I can't go on doing 2-hour streams. Nobody wants to listen to a 2-hour stream. And you look at several of the best ones out there, that some of the best podcasts I listen to, they're no more than 30 minutes long. Some of them are as short as 20, 25, up to 30, maybe 32 minutes, and that's it. So I want to start breaking the stream down in that fashion. I might start and stop the stream 2 or 3 times, stop and restart the stream 2 or 3 times during these long 2-hour shows for K-Talk Radio. Well, it's interesting that while Biden said the greatest threat to mankind is global warming, which right there could tell you how much of an idiot the man, poor man, was. Trump says the greatest threat to humanity is nuclear weapons. And he said this is much more significant danger than climate change. And he said those people whom he called climate lunatics that talk about global warming, that say the ocean is going to raise 1/8 of an inch in the next 300 years, he says nobody's talking about nuclear weapons. And therefore he proposes that all nations should eliminate their nuclear arsenals, that the U.S. and Russia are currently holding the largest stockpiles, while China, of course, is rapidly expanding its capabilities. But that Moscow said in response to Trump's remarks, they'd be ready to engage in arms control discussions, according to Peskov. So this is all really interesting, very much in flux. Obviously, this U.S.-Europe relationship, this current effort by the Europeans to continue this war effort has got to be derailed, because it's insane and it won't work. Now, on the Middle East battleground, there's an absolute flare-up of fighting in Syria that I'll get to here in the next hour. Since several days in the west of Syria, there have been fights between the former supporters of Assad and the troops from the so-called democratic al-Qaeda government. There's different figures. Several hundred fighters, over 800 civilians have been killed. It's clear about 10,000 refugees have fled Syria into Lebanon, threatening a spillover there, and obviously the situation in Lebanon is very fragile. The director of public relations in the Syrian Information Ministry accused Iran and Hezbollah of being behind the destabilization of their country through remnants of the former regime. There was a regional security meeting in Jordan on last Saturday, I think, of foreign ministers, defense ministers, directors of intelligence, chiefs of staff of Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, meeting to discuss securing the region from terrorism and security threats. They also fully supported the newly formed government in Syria, backing all its efforts to stabilize the country. But it's also very clear that the true face of this government is now showing its fangs. And the main victims are these Alawite supporters of the previous government and Christians and the Druze. Now, the Chinese government completely endorsed Egypt's Gaza plan, as also did France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. They said the plan shows a realistic path of reconstruction for Gaza and promises, if implemented, swift and sustainable improvement of these catastrophic conditions of the Palestinians living in Gaza. They also naturally support that Hamas cannot be part of the new government. In any case, it's the first step in the right direction. Well, Hamas never said they wanted to be part of the government. Hamas is a fighting arm of the Palestinian Authority, if I understand it correctly. Hamas said they just want the Palestinian Authority to be a part of figuring out what's going to happen to Gaza. They're not going to be a part of it, which of course is only referring to the internal buildup of Gaza. In 5 years, given the fact that the Egyptians have proven themselves tremendous city-building capabilities in Egypt, they're perfectly capable of implementing this in the Gaza, if they're allowed to do so, and sufficient funding coming from other Arabs is provided. But that obviously still leaves the West Bank. And I mean, essentially, it's clear that President Trump would have to do to Netanyahu and any other Israeli government official, if Netanyahu should resign or be removed, to do what he did with Zelensky. And this is where I'm still holding out some faith that those who think that I am having this Pollyanna attitude about Trump and Israel, I still think there's something coming here. And for Trump to finally put down his foot, stomp his foot down and say, all right, that's it, this stops, and it stops now. Well, why hasn't he already done it? Because he doesn't have the ducks all lined up, that's why. It's also clear the Oasis plan is a solution, but that requires an overall strategic reorientation of the other big countries, the United States, Russia, China, and its neighbors, India, Iran, and so that's basically the situation there. It seems Trump is very angry with King Charles, as he should be, that gave this reception to Zelensky. And it's mooted that this will cool his enthusiasm about King Charles's invitation for him to make a state visit, which Starmer had brought to the White House. Here's your official invitation from King Charles, Donald. Because basically, if King Charles, and I use the word king not out of respect, just trying to hit home the meaningless definition in my mind of king when it comes to human kings. Because obviously if Charles meets with Zelensky, that would take the glory out of a state visit from the United States president. Think about that for a minute. Charles gives this big reception to Zelensky, and now he's invited through Starmer's physical delivery of an official invite to come and meet with the King of England. England is shrinking into a far less powerful entity than it ever was for the last several hundred years. And if the king is willing to hold attendance from somebody like Zelensky, what does that mean about holding attendance with Trump or any other state official? In other words, if he's willing to sit down and eat crap at the table, what can he expect if Trump were to show up? Yeah, I said that. And note, for further instigation is the fact that 15 individuals of the Peter Thiel complex, I meant to get to this yesterday, is now part of the Trump government. And one of them is one heartbeat away from the presidency, Vance. But Vance hasn't done so badly so far. He's done pretty good. So we have to look into it. It seems there's a certain amount of targeting of Vance going on. Not only are these articles appearing about him, about his background with Peter Thiel by Bloomberg, but why would they oppose that? But also he went on a walk with his 3-year-old daughter and was heckled and harassed by Ukrainians in Vermont. And just to mention, there is this part of Germany's war-ready making that's going on, that there is now a very aggressive recruitment being done by the Bundeswehr. And they're going to all kinds of fairs, agricultural fairs, other fairs. They're promoting job offers in the schools. And the Bundeswehr recruited last year in Bavaria alone 3,000 young people, many of them younger than 18, which is 200 more than the year before. 366 of them are only 17 years old, and they need their parents' agreement and have psychological testing. That's quite worrisome. Even 16 young women were recruited this way at a very early age, just basically out of school. I don't think it'll be too long till you see that in this country. I remember in high school, at sporting events, senior year activities, there would be either ROTC would be there, ROTC, or other recruiters for all the various services with their tables off to the side at sports functions. Then after a while, you didn't see that anymore. And now the level of recruitment in the United States is way, way down. And look at what DEI brought into the services. Wow. IQ requirements dropped precipitously. Physical requirements dropped precipitously. And so as you see recruitment building up in various countries in Europe, primarily Germany, grabbing the young people. And why the young people? Because they don't know crap. They don't know anything yet. So those are just some of the major developments. I've got some other things I want to get to. I think the challenge to our thinking and the promotion of this new paradigm that's being represented by the Schiller Institute, that the only way you can possibly get out of these conflicts, starting with the United States, Russia, and China, is you've got to sit down and talk about creating a basic new security architecture that protects everybody. Trump initiated it by saying, let's get rid of these weapons. We don't need these things. Let's sit down and do business. I made a comment the other day. Someone was saying, aren't you afraid of this growing army of Russia? And I said, who have you been listening to? I'm not Russia, China. I said, who are you listening to? I said, I'll tell you what, they asked me a couple of questions. I said, I'll answer those questions if you can tell me any time China attacked somebody. Japan has attacked China. Other countries, you know, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But tell me where China attacked. China doesn't want to attack anybody. China doesn't want war. China just wants to do business. China has a much greater love affair with money than I think the American government does. Does that mean you turn your naked back to them? No. You still have your defensive capabilities. But look how fat China's become in just the last 25 years. 850 million Chinese lifted out of abject poverty into the condition they're in now, where you see less and less state police in public areas, as my son pointed out to me, having lived there for 6 years. He said the last year he was there, Dad, I hardly ever remember seeing a state police anywhere the last year he was living in China. So the European Union is in complete flux. NATO is moving into that fluxness themselves. You have Slovakia and Hungary in opposition to the Brussels policies. Cases like Croatia are starting to lean in that direction. Italy is very mixed. And then you have the governments that are promoting the policy. In France, you have a very weak government. In Germany, you've even with Merz coming in with 30%, it's still going to end up with a very weak government because of the 20% that supported the AfD. And then you have the SPD, had to, you know, who want to close the borders, which Merz is not in favor of. So the world situation is completely detonated quite a bit over the last few weeks. I mean, who would have thought that after 5 weeks of Trump coming into office, that you would have a split of that dimension between the Europe and the United States, where we were all buddy-buddy, arm in arm. And now the Europeans are running scared to death that the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO. And there's tons of these think tank statements and videos from the blogosphere. For example, people are now discovering that Germany is in a complete free fall in opposition to the United States that I've been talking about for months. But now it's openly in the news. So I think that's all I want to say at this point. I've got some other stuff I wanted to talk about. One thing in particular was Jeffrey Sachs' statement that Trump is getting close to supporting a Palestinian state. Now, in a forum sponsored from Australia yesterday, featuring 3 international relations experts, Jeffrey Sachs, one of my favorites on the Napolitano podcast, Francesca Albanese from Israel, and Hillel Shanker, the Australian-Russian expert Graham Gill. Professor Sachs made the point that only one country was responsible for preventing the official establishment of a state of Palestine when this came before the UN Security Council before. only one country stopped the UN from an official recognition of the state of Palestine. Can you guess who that was? Yeah, the United States. And the U.S. has used its veto power to prevent a UN declaration to that effect. I mean, it's the UN that created Israel. The UN can create a Palestinian state. And every time it's come from a vote, the United States would veto it. But the extraordinary steps taken by Trump so far to end the Ukraine war, establish diplomatic relations with Russia, to declare a cease, and then twist Netanyahu's arms off, practically, to declare a ceasefire in Gaza, point in the direction of lifting that veto at long last, allowing a UN declaration of a Palestinian statehood. And Sachs, here just the other day, said that the only way to get world support for a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine is for the UN declaration of statehood. That the Trump administration, he says, is not far from a shift toward withholding U.S. veto on such a vote. He said that the Arab plan for rebuilding Gaza put forward in the Cairo meeting last week is supported by France and Germany and Italy and UK, as well as by Hamas. And a positive U.S. vote for statehood, he said, is close, very, very close. It is not impossible, Sachs said. Well, the forum was sponsored by Australian professor Joseph Calamari, who works with Chandra Muzaffar and Richard Falk in the Malaysian-based Save Humanity and Planet Earth group. Another speaker was the UN rapporteur for Palestine, Francesca Albanese, who said that the disaster in Palestine should not be called a conflict. She said the genocide in South Africa wasn't called a conflict, nor should the genocide in Palestine be called a conflict. A colonial military dictatorship and ethnic cleansing should not be granted the term conflict, but only genocide. And the genocide, she said, was the most predictable and most preventable in all of history. Hillel Shenker, an Israeli peace advocate and co-editor of the Palestine-Israel Journal and co-founder of Peace Now, also spoke. He said that most Israelis oppose the right-wing government of Netanyahu and his fascist backers. He said the majority of Israelis want peace and the freedom of the hostages. He said the question is, will Trump treat Netanyahu the way he did Zelensky? And after what Netanyahu has seen Trump do with Zelensky, I think that's a good question. He praises Trump for rearranging the recent U.S. meetings with Hamas, and he warned that there is no empathy between Israelis and Palestinians. Then Sachs commented on the conflict between Trump and Europe. He said Trump gave up its sovereignty and independent policy 30 years ago. Biden, he said, was the worst U.S. president in history, and Netanyahu is an idiot. He said Trump has shown that he can break from the deep state, and he should do the same with Israel. He said the timidity of the Arab states in backing the Palestinians is a result of their colonization over the past century, first by the French, and then the British in the 1920s, and then the U.S. after World War II. He said he's hopeful that Saudi Arabia will stick to its insistence that there must be a state of Palestine before there can be any formal relations with Israel. I think that's really good. I don't like the fact that a student leader at Columbia University was arrested for deportation. I mean, this is having some serious problems with free speech. I have some notes here from New Regions of Russia magazine, March 10th. An interview between Lavrov and how Russia's coexistence with the countries of the collective West, by implication, of course, the United States, how that is possible. And I'm not going to go through all the points Lavrov pointed out, but the one thing he did is the West has to recognize its past mistakes. In other words, the West has to own up to to the lies they've told. All right, now I wanted to get into this war stuff. But I don't want to leave the massacre in Latakia just yet. The slaughter of these Alawites in Latakia province marks the culmination of this brutal proxy war launched by Barack Obama and finalized by Joe Biden, leading to the collapse of Syria's secular government and the rise of this terrorist regime. Syria was once admired as the most democratic country in the Arab Middle East because they had a constitutionally elected president, Bashar al-Assad, and an advanced 2012 constitution that guaranteed freedom of religion, speech, and women's rights. And now you see why the West had to get rid of Assad. You can't have all these people running around free, especially the women. And now under the rule of an ex-Al-Qaeda warlord that we put in there, in Al-Qaeda, because of course Israel is the one that created Al-Qaeda, we know that, and they created ISIS and all these other things to make sure that the United States would be there to support Israel. I mean, we know that. And now there's this ex-Al-Qaeda warlord. This country has descended into mass killings, terror, revenge massacres targeting religious minorities, and a proxy war that has led to slaughter. Now, the crisis goes back to 2011, when the Obama administration orchestrated the overthrow of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi to seize its massive arsenal of advanced weapons. That's why they wanted it. They wanted the gold, and they wanted Gaddafi's mass arsenal of advanced weapons. These weapons were then transferred to the Syrian militants via Turkey under the CIA's covert program, Timber Sycamore, and the goal was to aim a jihadist army drawn from across the globe, igniting a war that resulted in over 500,000 deaths. Remember, just characterized by mass beheadings, systematic rape, crucifixions, other kinds of atrocities. And right in the middle of that, of course, was Obama and his Secretary of State, Her Excellency, Ms. Clinton. And we know what happened with the, I don't want to get into it. We know what happened in that whole deal, and then the murder of Gaddafi, and then they were able to there was nobody left to stop them from stealing Gaddafi's weapons. And then, of course, as I said, they ran them over to the Middle East, armed the people who would be fighting against Assad under the CIA's covert Timber Sycamore. Now, one of the key figures to emerge from this conflict was Mohammed al-Jawlani, who was a former lieutenant of the ISIS leader, al-Baghdadi. And once a prisoner of the U.S. Army, he was mysteriously released just as the CIA was activating Project Timber Sycamore in Syria, and he became the leader of al-Nusra, later renamed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which was in fact al-Qaeda in Syria. And just 10 years earlier, 19 men from al-Qaeda were part of the hijacked passenger jets crashing into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in the infamous 9/11 attacks. I know you're like me, you question whether or not a jet hit the Pentagon. That killed 3,000 Americans, many of whom leapt to their deaths to avoid the flames. Can you imagine that? Being up on floor 150 or whatever it was towards the top, and you've got these flames coming in from one side of the room and an open window looking down at the street, and you would jump rather than get burned. I can't imagine what would be going on in their mind in a moment like that. Nonetheless, Al-Qaeda in Syria, under its various names, became the core of the covert CIA operation to topple the constitutionally elected government of Assad. And so you have this anti-Syrian US-led alliance steadfastly supported as they fought to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. And this even though al-Jawlani himself was designed as an especially dangerous terrorist who at one time, when at the same time Biden was recognizing his control of Syria, had a $10 million bounty on his head. Remember that? And so in his waning days, the Biden administration initiated this covert operation in conjunction with Turkey and other nations and made the final push to topple Assad. And exhausted by 14 years of Western blockades and debanking and sanctions and the U.S. military occupation and the theft of their food and their fuel in the north, Syria's forces succumbed, leading to Jawlani's rise to power. And so he, as soon as that happened, he quickly shed his jihadist image, donned a suit and tie, and rebranded himself as President Ahmed al-Sharaa, claiming to be a moderate leader. Not elected, just declared himself president. However, his past atrocities, including thousands of rapes and beheadings, remain undeniable. And one of his first acts as Syria's new ruler was appointing Shadi al-Waisi as justice minister, a man caught on video personally ordering the execution of women for adultery. And so as Jawlani's, of course now al-Sharaa's forces solidified control, they quietly launched these combing operations to find and exterminate leaders of the Alawites and the Christians and the other religious minorities. And the Alawite defenders, led by elite veterans of the 4th Division Tiger Forces of Assad, attempted to resist, but they were just horribly outnumbered. The death toll quickly surpassed 1,000, is still rapidly rising, with defenseless women, children, and entire families just slaughtered in cold blood. And fearing mass execution, thousands of these civilians have fled for sanctuary at the Russian military base, which admitted a lot of them, and the eyewitnesses were describing just absolute scenes of horror. Quote, this is from Reuters. Armed men were moving from house to house, attacking people as a form of entertainment. They declared jihad on us from all over Syria. My 70-year-old uncle, a history professor, and his 60-year-old wife were killed in cold blood at their home. In a video at night, an armed militant with an Egyptian accent was heard taunting Alawite civilians. To the Alawites, we are coming to slaughter you and your fathers. So CNN reported that other videos on Syrian social media showed brutal executions. One showed a militant pulling up to a house on a motorcycle, then forcing the resident to look at the camera before executing him. Another shows a man forced to bark like a dog before being shot and killed. This merciless behavior is very typical of jihadis throughout their war against Syria, but it serves as a reminder of why there was no choice for the Assad government but to employ force to protect the Syrian people. So, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio issued a statement. He said, the United States condemns the radical Islamist terrorists, including foreign jihadis, that murdered people in western Syria in recent days. The United States stands with Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, including its Christian, Druze, Alawite, and Kurdish communities, and offers its condolences to the victims and other families. Then on X, Greek Prime Minister Antonis Samaras blasted Western support for the Turkish-backed regime, saying, what is happening in Syria is neo-Ottoman inspired and is being implemented by the terrorists of Ahmad al-Sharaa, who did not change just because he put on a tie. Replacing an authoritarian leader with a leading member of al-Qaeda inevitably led to massacres of thousands of civilians and scenes of barbarism that humanity cannot bear. Then he urged the EU to condemn the massacres and reinstate sanctions against the al-Sharaa regime. And despite his official denials, evidence suggests that the HTS leader al-Jawlani, now al-Sharaa, ordered his fighters to stop filming the atrocities to avoid further international backlash. So according to DD Geopolitics, Hayr Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS leader Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, has instructed militants to stop recording their acts of violence in a clear effort to control the narrative and minimize the damage to his public image. If you're going to rape these women, stop filming it. If you're going to kill these older men and women in their homes, stop filming it. So although the Western media has long portrayed Assad as a brutal dictator, the scale of violence under al-Jawlani's rule has exceeded even the worst predictions. The mass extermination of Alawites and Christians is unfolding as a stark reminder of what happens when radical jihadists are handed power under the guise of democracy. And the Western powers condemned President Assad for being overly harsh with Islamic terrorists invading Syria, but these events demonstrate that no leader, however kind or enlightened, could possibly have suppressed such horrors without force. I think it's time we face that reality. Assad wasn't being an evil dictator. He was trying to defend his citizens against an invading army armed by the United States and supported by the United States to get rid of Assad. Why get rid of Assad? I mean, when the Biden administration toppled Assad, there was no one left to defend the Syrians. And now the Alawites and the Christian populations are dwindling under systemic extermination. Syria is being redrawn under the dominance of one of the world's most dangerous terrorists, and the question now is Syria going to emerge as a new Islamic caliphate, which is what some people in the know seem to be predicting. Why get rid of Assad? A constitutional government, the most free government in the Middle East, actually had a Bill of Rights, actually productive. But Israel wanted Syria out of the way. Israel needs to eliminate Syria before Israel can go after Iran. That's one of the reasons why. And then there's the control of the gas lines flowing through Syria that Russia has control of. Well, we can't let those Ruskies have that much. Look at all the oil they got. They don't need it anymore. We're going to bypass them and go through Turkey into Eastern Europe and triple what the Russians were charging. Oh, boy. And so what's Trump going to do about this? The slaughter of these civilians. You know, a lot of people hastily point to the Biden administration and wave the finger at the 11th hour decision for the HTS group to be given the cash to advance on Damascus and overthrow Assad. So the question is, was it a decision taken entirely by Netanyahu, or did he consult Biden? Did Trump know anything about it at all when this happened? Because it happened under Biden's regime. But what is clearer that America's history of backing terror groups comes with a very heavy cost, as there is no mistake now that the HTS cannot reform into the required version of a moderate Islamic government which the West can do business with. No, they're murdering, raping, murdering terrorists. And now they have control of Syria. The problem, of course, is that if you fight such terror groups head on, you're feeding the axis of resistance, which is a greater enemy. It's going to be a very tough call for Trump as to what's going to happen there, for sure. Now, former American President Jimmy Carter said in 2018 that in America there were 226 years of wars since its independence, which took place 242 years ago, thus leaving only 16 years of peace. And I remember when he said that, and I remember thinking, yeah, that's probably right. 242 years ago. Now, we're coming into the 250th year, but at the time, 8 years ago, there were 226 years of war, so there's only 16 years of peace since the American government was formed up until 2018. Since World War II, there were 32 American military conflicts involving dozens of countries. Some of these military conflicts have lasted over 20 years. Some others are still continuing. In other words, the U.S. is a country of perpetual war. This is something Trump has to deal with, because I think he actually really does want to bring war to an end. And war is probably one of the most, if not the most, destructive human activity. Millions of human beings are being sacrificed. Tens of trillions of dollars worth of housing, school, factories, hospitals, other infrastructure, bridges have been destroyed in these countries which have been the target of American military attacks. And this perpetual war has destroyed the very foundation of freedom and democracy. It has prevented any kind of equitable economic development in the world, led to massive violations of human rights, ruined the traditional values of many of these countries, and has caused all this human suffering that is still going on. So among America's multi-trillion-dollar perpetual war has, at the same time, denied and deprived millions of Americans of decent income, of adequate housing, food, health care, safety on the street, reliable infrastructure facilities, essential education, other goods and services that are needed for decent living. Before I go any further, I want to quote Dwight Eisenhower. This is an address to the North American Society of News Editors, April 16, 1953. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hope of children. So, I got 6 questions to ask you. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I'll probably pick this up Monday, but maybe I can in shorter bursts between now and then. I think I'm really ready to do that. 6 questions. How many wars has the U.S. undertaken since World War II? How are the American wars organized? What is the purpose of the American wars? Who are the beneficiaries of the American wars? What are the negative impacts of the American wars, and will the American wars continue? So how many wars, to answer that first question, how many wars has the U.S. undertaken since World War II? And that's defining a war in terms of American military intervention, where the American military has had boots on the ground or ships at sea or planes in the air firing on an enemy. 32 wars undertaken by the U.S. since World War II. And these wars have been classified into 3 areas. Invasions, 23 cases. Civil war, sponsored by the U.S., 7 cases. And multi-target wars, 2. Which gives 32 wars since the end of World War II, the so-called post-war era. Now, there are reasons to believe that there are still many undeclared military inventions conducted by war contractors and special operation forces where it was spread among our 900 plus bases in 191 countries. And I have a list here of the American wars. The Korean War, 1950 to 53. The Vietnam War, 55 to 75. The Cuban Bay of Pigs, 61. Lebanon, 82 to 84. Grenada, 83. Libya bombing, 84. The Tanker War in the Persian Gulf, 84 to 87. Panama, 89 to 90. The Gulf War, 89 to 91. The Iraq War, 91 to 93. The Bosnian War, 92 to 95. Haiti, 94 to 1999. Kosovo, 98 to 99. Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. Yemen, 2002 to the present. Iraq, 2003 to 2011. Pakistan, 2004 to 2018. Somalia, 2007 to the present. Libya, 2011. Niger, 2013 to the present. Libya, 2011. Niger, 2013 to present. Iraq, 2014 to 2021. Syria, 2014 to the present. Libya, 2015 to 2019. And the Ukraine that's yet to be categorized. Civil wars the United States has been involved with and supported. The Indochina, 59 to 75. Indonesia, 58 to 61. Lebanon, 1958. Dominican Republic, 68 to 69. Korea's DMZ, 66, 69. Cambodia, 67 to 75. Somalia, 1991 to the present. And then multi-target wars, Operation Ocean Shield, the Indian Ocean, 2008 to 2016. And then Operation Observant Compass, Uganda and Central Africa, 2011 to 2017. That's a lot of bullets, a lot of bombs, a lot of jets. It's just fascinating when you can categorize this stuff and get a more encompassing view of this. Because to understand the nature and the implication of perpetual war in the United States, you have to understand the concept of the American pro-war community, the APWC, the American pro-war communities. So in literature and in media, we use the notion of the military-industrial complex to describe the vast system of perpetual U.S. wars. But actually, the system of perpetual wars involves an awful lot more individuals and a lot more organizations than just the military-industrial complex. And the American pro-war community is a tightly knit community promoting its interests at the expense of the well-being of ordinary Americans and the interests of the American people and the interests of the people in these target countries. So well organized, so well rooted, so powerful that it is quasi-impossible to dissolve it. And the American pro-war community core group comprises the war corporations and the federal government led by the Pentagon, Congress, Senate, and the other governmental agencies. And there's two supporting groups that comprise all sorts of institutions and organizations. There is a group that supports the supply of war goods and services, and then there's a group that supports the creation for demand for war goods and services. And so the efficacy of the whole system of producing and selling war goods and services depends on how the core group and the supporting groups can work together in harmony to attain the objective of the war, the maximization of profit, in the interest of the all war promoting community sharing the profit. And the supply of war goods and services is assured by war corporations which produce the weapons, building contractors which build all sorts of buildings and manage them, catering services that provide the food and drinks for the GIs, the information firms which offer information needed for wars, and even the academics that offer the ideas and the technologies. In the U.S., 40 major war corporations, 40 in the United States on contract from our federal government, annual sales of almost $600 billion. So you see a military budget that just went through of almost $1 trillion, 900 and something billion. 600 billion of that is to these corporations that support the war. Now I've got a table here in front of me that I'm looking at. How many billions of dollars that they received in 2022 from the federal government? Lockheed Martin, 65 billion. Growth rate of 7.7% per year. You can't have a growth rate like that without war. Raytheon, 56 billion. Boeing, 58 billion. Northrop Grumman, 36 billion. General Dynamics, 37 billion. And just to those 5 groups, $241 billion in 2022. That's not support groups or anything else. That's just those that make the planes and the bombs. The combined annual sale of the 5 leading firms in 2022, $241 billion, of which 183 was for the sale of military goods and services, or 75% of the total sale. The supply of war goods and services relies on the extensive production chain that involves foreign and domestic providers of these raw materials and intermediary products. In addition, the academics and information firms offer information, technology, other services needed for the production of weapons. So I have a list here of well-known universities that are deeply involved in the American wars. No less than 70% of academic university research projects are funded by the Pentagon. No less than 70% of university research projects are funded by the Pentagon. The Boston College helps the Air Force. The University of Massachusetts at Lowell develops nanotechnology for the Army. Tufts University improves soldiers' cognitive and physical performance. MIT is producing so many war goods, its services, that it's now known as a war corporation, just MIT is. Columbia University, Brown University develops for DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, the neural engineering systems. Princeton University produces hardware for design and verification of open source integrated circuits. Dartmouth University sells machine learning. Pennsylvania University develops artificial intelligence. Stanford University develops technology for chemical warfare and so many other war goods and services that it's considered to be a partnership with war corporations. Harvard University develops educational materials for the war, and it's the main source for providing human resources to the war industries. By the way, it produced the napalm bomb widely used in the Korean War, Vietnam War, and other wars. Johns Hopkins University makes tools needed for the evaluation of alternative offensive capability needed for battles in the air, sea, and cyberspace. And the sad story is that the American universities depend on war money so much that they're losing their original mission. Now, when I saw this Pennsylvania University developing artificial intelligence, I don't know if you happened to catch the news this morning of this breakout fight at a high school basketball tournament game that really got out of hand. I mean, they had just people all over the floor socking each other and punching, knocking people down. The police are involved, they're getting knocked down. Coaches involved, they're getting knocked down. Families coming to the defense of their sons because it's a male game, they're getting knocked down. Just this massive brouhaha. And the two teams, it's unrelated to anything I've talked about today. I just found it funny. I was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And Uniontown is a town without fame. except there was one famous, oh, if I forget his name now, one very famous person who was born in Uniontown. And it might be um, the, I'll think of it in a minute. Warren Buffett. I think Warren Buffett was born in Uniontown. I'm not positive, but that's the name that comes to mind. Uniontown's the town I was born in. That was one of the two teams. So when I saw this fight going on the TV screen this morning when I was catching up on the news of this high school game in Pennsylvania, down at the bottom it had the two scores, Uniontown and some other team, Lowell or something like that. And Uniontown was being beat by over 10 points at the time the fight broke out. Yeah, that's my claim to fame. The home of Warren Buffett and then the home of a big basketball fight. That's about it. Anyway, I had to mention that. But the sad story of this, the war industry. And so, you know, the song, War. War, what's it good for? Absolutely nothing. No, it's good for business. War has always been good for business. It's not good for absolutely nothing. I never liked that song anyway. Or is the group named War? But you know the song I'm talking about from the 60s. And yeah, war's good for something. It's good for business. It's good for really good business. Despite who is getting killed, that doesn't matter. I mean, what distinguishes the war economy from a peace economy is the amazing fact that the war economy generates the demand for peace. Who would be out crying peace if there wasn't war? And in the American war economy, the final demand for war goods and services is determined by the Pentagon, you know, in some foreign countries. But the supply determines the demand. It's kind of interesting how this, you know, because the Pentagon doesn't have all the information that's needed to estimate the demand for war, so that it relies on the information provided by war corporations. And the war corporations, which are our suppliers of the people who will fill these jobs, the people who will be working these positions, have an amazing role of determining the demand. And in this way, the market of war goods and services, the supply determines the demand. And that's the root of a perpetual relationship between American wars and the making of the profit that goes to the war community. Now, to have war, you have to have an enemy. And the war corporations don't have the research capacity to find real enemies or produce fabricated enemies. The role of finding or fabricating enemies goes to the think tanks that are lavishly paid for by the war corporations. Irwin Starr, is that war? Yeah, okay, thanks, Bruce. You always fill in the best information. Thank you. And so you have this circle that feeds off of itself. And so the demand for war goods and services created by these pro-war think tanks ends up accounting for most of the annual defense budget of the U.S. that amounts to, in 2023, as much as $886 billion. In the budget last year is just over $900 billion. Now, imagine this. Washington's 2023 defense budget is 50% of South Korea's total GDP. And the American defense budget is 40% of the global defense budget. And the big five, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics, gets as much as $150 billion out of the defense budget. The rest of it goes to catering and housing and support services like that. And the think tanks play a major role in perpetuating these wars. Their function is to produce reports and papers to show the seriousness of crisis and the need for increasing the military budget so the crisis can be tackled by the military force. What a racket. What a racket. And what would happen to this racket if you brought the world's worst so-called, so identified by American media, terrorist and enemies of mankind governments like Russia and China to the bargaining table where you sit down and you decide, what do we have to do to have no more war? Well, we have to get rid of the threat of war. How do we get rid of the threat of war? Well, we get together and we create economic unity and economic capabilities and projects that we both immediately benefit from. You mean we beat our swords into plowshares? Something like that? You can't make money beating your swords into plowshares. When you look at the groups that are constantly trying to find reasons to go to war, there's the Center for Strategic International Studies, the Center for a New American Century, PNAC of course, Hudson Institute, Atlantic Council, International Institute of Strategic Studies, every one of these getting tons and tons of money to sit together and figure out who's the next enemy, how are we going to make them an enemy, and how do we prove that they're an enemy of mankind so we can go in and justify all this money that we're being given. Well, it may sound a little cynical, but I intended it to sound a little cynical. What a business. So that's why some of the best investment houses have always said, what are the investments in the stock market that are usually pretty safe and productive? Pharmaceutical industry, defense industry. They usually generate a profit on a regular basis. There are people who would never get a COVID vaccine, but they don't have any trouble investing in Pfizer or Moderna because it makes financial sense to do so. It may not make biological sense to be injected with those chemicals, but it makes financial sense to invest in those companies that make these biologics to inject in other people who aren't so reticent to have it done. You wouldn't want your daughters, your sons, drafted into a war to fight the Russians in the Ukraine. But who wouldn't invest in Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics? They always turn a profit. It's kind of like the drug business coming across our borders. You may not think that you would necessarily consider yourself a druggie, but you might hit marijuana or cocaine or fentanyl or something on a party basis. I think that'll do it for today's show. I'm going to shut down the recording at K-Talk right now for today. I'll save it here in a second. And then I'm going to turn the radio back over to the computer. You keep your wits about you. I will be joining you tomorrow for a health show. And turn that on. And then for my streamers, thank you so much. Oh my goodness, there's a much higher number than normal. Thank you so much for being a part of the show today. This is going to be saved at both Facebook and X for future reference. And I'm going to end the stream here for Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell, and I will be back tomorrow with breaking health barriers and some topics that are very prescient. I will